Good evening, everyone. I'm Amos Goldberg, and I will be chairing this very important event. We are here tonight, and as we heard from Shai, to celebrate, if this is the right word, the publication of a very important book on a topic which we are very much concerned about, the rise of anti-Semitism all over the world, and particularly in the United Kingdom. This is a very fine and nuanced, and we already heard about it, book that tries to tell us, as its title betrays, what anti-Semitism is, but not less important, what it is not. It rightly rings the bells of alarm, but not seduced into hysteria. It makes essential and subtle distinctions. But today we will be discussing this book and this topic of anti-Semitism from a very specific point of view, and that is from here, from Jerusalem, the heart of Israel-Palestine, and the heart of the conflict between Israel and Palestinians. And to illustrate this particular point of view, let me turn now to a Polish Jew from Warsaw, Chaim Aaron Kaplan, a principal of a Hebrew language school and a faithful, devoted, right-wing leaning Zionist in 1936. Following the outbreak of the Arab revolt in Palestine, to which his 2 children had emigrated, he complains that anti-Semitism had motivated the Arabs of Palestine, just as it had the Christians in Europe. But then, in his diary, to a large extent following the Iron Wall of Jabotinsky, he explicitly rejects this explanation as, I quote, mere Zionist propaganda. Because differently from Europe, the Arabs claim, and this is what he says, and their turn towards violence were justified, according to what he says, they are justified. They would gladly give up all the wealth and prosperity that the Zionist Jews brought with them, as long as they didn't take away their land. The Zionist Jews had not formally, this is what he says, it's a quote, declared the war on the Arabs, but we were the cause of this war, and the subjective justice is with those who declared it, namely the Arabs, he writes. This he writes in 1936, while his too is very, very worried about his daughter and son in Palestine, and while he sits in Warsaw after he tried to immigrate and failed and came back to Warsaw. So what is anti-Semitism today? What parts of what we understand as anti-Semitism are indeed worrisome, perhaps even dangerous, and what parts of it are, as Kaplan suggests, just Zionist propaganda? How can we distinguish between the legitimate critique and a hate speech? And where are the boundaries of free speech at a time of rising illiberal democracies? These are very urgent questions that are asked in the book, and we ask after reading this book. So it's a very timely and a very important and a very suggestive book. We have 3 very distinguished speakers who I will introduce right away, all of them together, and each of them will talk 15 to 20 minutes, and afterwards we will have Julia respond. So the first speaker will be, I will introduce them very, very shortly. The first will be Professor Eva Illouz. She holds the Rose Isaac Chair at the Hebrew University. She is the author of 13 books translated in 22 languages and the recipient of the French Légion d'honneur and the Emet Award, the highest scientific distinction in Israel. The second speaker would be Dr. Raif Zrek. He earned his degrees at the Hebrew University, at Columbia University, and his doctorate at the Harvard Law School in 2007. He also practiced law himself for more than 10 years. He's also written a lot, and we are all in a way I guess many of those who sit here perceive themselves as his students, but I want to emphasize one of his articles which made the most impression on me. When does the settler becomes native in Constellation 2016? The last speaker would be Professor Emeritus Moshe Zimmerman. I think most of us also know him. Professor Emeritus of German History, 1986 to 2012. During those years, he was the director of the Richard Koebner Center for German History in the Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Author, again, of many publications, a lot in German, English, and Hebrew. Many of them relate to the issue of to the topic of anti-Semitism in Germany, in Israel, and worldwide. Especially, I mean, there are also many books and many edited volumes that I can mention, but I will mention that he was the first one to really write a comprehensive a book on Wilhelm Marr, the Patriarch of Anti-Semitism, New York, 1986. So I think we are expecting to have a very interesting, perhaps dense evening. And Eva, I invite you to begin.
Can I sit here? Yes, I can sit here. Yeah. Okay, I want to thank, first of all, Shai Lavi for putting his trust in me and inviting me here, given that I'm not at all a specialist of anti-Semitism. And thank you, Shai. Anti-Semitism is, of course, an ideology, a murderous one at that. But a great deal of anti-Semitism is, I think, about thoughtlessness, not thinking, taking shortcuts, falling on stereotypes, old cliches and new cliches. And I think, so this is what will interest me in this very short presentation. I will talk about thoughtlessness, because I think that this kind of thoughtlessness emerges in specific conditions. And I want to see quickly what can be some of these conditions and why anti-Semitism is such an unbearably easy way of thinking. And it seems to me that some of the reasons why today anti-Semitism is the kind of default way of thinking is because of its ambiguities, slipperiness, and contradictions, and more specifically because of the ambiguity, slipperiness, and contradictions of Israel and the Jewish communities worldwide. So let me repeat that I'm not at all a scholar of anti-Semitism, and that I know, I think, what everybody knows, maybe even less. So what I'm going to present really are only some thoughts as a citizen of France and Israel, stressing, as Amos did, that my perspective is going to be actually more from Israel than from France. The book by Julia Neuberger is the book I would have wished to write had it been in Europe, but that I would not have written as a citizen of Israel. And so I'm going to speak. I want to emphasize here the context within which this speech occurs, because I would not have said necessarily the same thing in a different context. So I'm going to build this talk around a few vignettes, which all of you know. Vignette number one. During one of his recent confrontations with congressional Democrats, Donald Trump made a stunning comment about the United States Jewish population. How could Jewish voters overwhelmingly support the Democratic Party, he said, when it included prominent critics of Israel like Rashida Tlaib and Ilan Omar? When American Jews voted for those politicians or other members of the same party who hate Israel and hate Jewish people, I quote him, they must be ignorant or, still worse, disloyal. Was Trump trafficking in long-standing anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish dual loyalty? Or was he highlighting his ironclad support for Israel's security, a major priority of AIPAC and several other Jewish organizations? I leave these questions unanswered on purpose, because precisely what interests me is the ambiguity. And so this is the same Trump who appointed the Nazi sympathizer Sebastian Gorka, who is a military analyst who became his assistant. This is the same Trump who in 2017, about those who chanted in Charlottesville, "Jews will not replace us," and said about those people that they are very fine people. It is the same Trump who, when the White House issued a statement on Holocaust Remembrance Day, neglected to mention the Jews even after when it was pointed out to him. And it is his son, Trump Jr., who wrote in a tweet that for those who don't know who Adam Schiff is the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, and he's a Jew. He is not just a radical liberal, he's someone who has been picked and supported by George Soros. And as the book documents very well, George Soros has become a kind of code word for anti-Semites, since George Soros is a Jewish billionaire who funds philanthropic works and has become castigated as a figure of hatred by anti-Semites. So I'm going to use these anecdotes to start thinking about anti-Semitism today and why it is, I think, more difficult today, much more difficult to capture and define. So to go back to the vignette that I just mentioned, the vignette, I call this vignette number 1, we can say that Trump is a fierce Zionist, and we saw this in his move of the American embassy. We see this in his support for annexation. We see this for the ways in which he lambasted the Jews who vote Democrats, presumably who are not enough Zionists. And at the same time, I think he's a fairly free anti-Semite. I mean, he uses very freely anti-Semitic tropes, such as referring to Jewish power or to the disloyalty of the Jews, or simply in the fact that Trump supports neo-Nazis and white supremacy. And so we have both things happening at the same time. And I think the reason why committed Jews and Zionist Jews like Sheldon Adelson and his wife and a significant part of the American Orthodox community supports Trump with adoration, it must be said, is very troubling. And it is based, I think it is mostly based on his political support of Israel. And so from this, very simply, I suggest, in a fairly straightforward way, that it is Zionism and his pro-Israel positions that trump the real anti-Semitism of Trump. So for me, what is very interesting to notice is that we can have anti-Semitism and Zionism coexisting in the same person at the same time, as one single policy, if you want, at the same time. And what is interesting also is that the reason why the OU community, the Orthodox community, and AIPAC are not more, and the reason why they're not more outraged than they should be, is because in the two sides of this equation, they choose for Israel. And that is because the support for Israel has come to play a role so fundamental in Jewish identity that it erases and obliterates other forms of identification, which, which other Jews could hold. Vignette number 2. The official body representing French Jews were among the critics of an incident at a march against Islamophobia in Paris a few Sundays ago, during which some participants donned yellow stars embossed with the word Muslim in a conscious echo of the yellow Star of David, which Jews living under the Nazi German occupation were forced to wear on their clothing. A crowd of 13,500 marched in the center of the French capital to protest anti-Muslim bigotry in the wake of an arson attack against a mosque in the city of Bayonne on October 28, in which 2 people were injured. One of the 2 men arrested in connection with the attack was a former parliamentary candidate for the Rassemblement National, the main far-right party in France. So, according to a French newspaper, the controversial yellow star stickers were worn by a few dozen protesters. Among them was an 11-year-old who was photographed wearing the yellow star while standing along Esther Ben-Bassa, who is a Jew and a former Israeli, a representative of the left-wing Green Party in the French Senate. Francis Khalifa, who is the president of the CRIF, the representative body of the French Jews, accused the marchers of appropriating the symbols of the Holocaust. I quote him, "It is scandalous to compare the fate of today's Muslims to the fate of the Jews during Nazi barbarism," Khalifa told. And he says there were 73,000 deportees in France. Khalifa said that while he condemned violence directed against Muslims with the greatest strength, the bracketing of 6 million murdered Jews with recent anti-Muslim acts is an amalgam that cannot be accepted. Ben-Bassa reacted sharply to the criticism, and she protested on Twitter that she was being accused of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, despite the fact that she is Jewish and even Israeli. Ben-Bassa says, "The condition of the Jews in those dark years and that of the Muslims today are not comparable, but it is quite understandable that those who are stigmatized today should identify with these past sufferings. Nobody is stealing their suffering from anyone." Ben-Bassa also pointed out that the stickers did not show a 6-pointed star of David, but a 5-pointed star alongside the traditional crescent of Islam. Note here that the scuffle is between 2 Jews, and I think it's becoming increasingly frequent that the issue of anti-Semitism is actually argued over within the Jewish community or between Jews themselves, which in itself is a very interesting, I think, phenomenon. So one is representative of Jewish institutions, and the other is an elected a member of the left in France. Note also that it is about the question of who owns the symbol of the Shoah. We have on the one hand someone who wants to borrow and appropriate the Shoah to represent the victimization of Muslims in France, and on the other, someone who insists on not lending the Shoah to a community who suffers from racism, but whose fate is far from being that of the people rounded up to be sent in concentration camps. What Khalifa is saying, and by the way, I agree with Khalifa, is that you can't trivialize Jewish disasters like this by, using them just anytime, anywhere for anybody. So on the one hand, we have one position which wants to generalize the Shoah to refer to all vulnerable groups, and we have another position which insists on safeguarding its uniqueness in order, I presume, to safeguard the value of Jewish life. This is particularly important in France because, for example, the murder of Sarah Halimi, it was an anti-Semitic murder. The murder of Sarah Halimi was not indicted for murder. He was found by the judge not responsible because he had smoked cannabis beforehand. So there was a great sense that Jewish life was being cheapened in France. Vignette number 3. This is happening in Benedictine University in America. After a speech that a scholar, Harold Kasimov, gave, and this was reported in Haaretz, So Kasimov was a survivor of the Holocaust as a child. He gave his speech at Benedictine University. And a senior of the university, Aya Ali, who is a Palestinian, asked if the Shoah was like the current treatment of Palestinians by Israel. And the newspaper article also says that according to her Twitter page, she is a member of Students for Justice in Palestine. So she says to him, according to the newspaper article, "You are willing to share your story with us, but I wanted to bring your attention towards a similar story. I'm sure you know about what's happening in Palestine, and my question to you is, do you support or do you condemn the establishment of the Zionist Israeli state, and whether it's okay to exile or completely the complete ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people the way that the Jewish people were exiled and ethnically cleansed?" End of quote. Kasimov responded that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not an area of my experience. And even though he's not happy with the government in Israel, he thinks that the Jewish state has a right to exist. He says, if Israel should exist, yes, I believe Israel should exist. Ali responded that she's the result of experiences that you, Kasimov, have been through. I am a survivor of the Intifada, adding that it is disappointing to know that a Holocaust survivor would remain neutral in a situation of injustice. Kasimov replied, "It's not a matter of being neutral. It's not total guilt or innocence on either side." And following that response, Ali left and walked out. So the young Ali operates a semantic shift that is frequently found on the European left, namely that Israel's injustices and even atrocities, let's say it straightforwardly, put into question its very existence. And this is why anti-Zionism is included in the 11 criteria provided by the IRA to define anti-Semitism. And Baroness Julia Neuberger speaks about those criteria in her book. So the IRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and anti-Zionism is one of the ways in which anti-Semitism is defined. So this young lady, I think, would qualify with IRA's definition. Namely, denying I quote the definition, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming, for example, that the existence of the state is a racist endeavor, end of quote. But I want to suggest here again a difficulty, and a semantic difficulty. And I want to suggest that this form of anti-Semitism, if it is one, is entirely intertwined with the moral claim of a people who has been and is being continually oppressed. It should be sharply differentiated from, for example, what somebody wrote in the Daily Stormer in 2017, and Daily Stormer, which counts many Trumpists. As Hitler says, people will become confused and disheartened if they feel there are multiple enemies. As such, all enemies, he says, should be combined, for the sake of clarity. They should be combined into one enemy. And he says, this enemy is the Jews. So I think we all sense very intuitively, I bring this example just to say how much we sense that this kind of claims is profoundly different from the anti-Zionism of the kind that Ali represents. Because, as I said, it is intertwined with moral claims, the moral claims of a people. So this is, so I say this very quickly. And the vignettes, a number of vignettes, but all included in what I call vignette number 4. Under Orban's government in Hungary, The country has shown very troubling signs of legitimation of anti-Semitism. In 2015, the Hungarian government announced its intention to erect a statue in honor and in memory of Bálint Homan, a minister who played a decisive role in deporting 600,000 Hungarian Jews. Far from being an isolated incident, only a few months later, in 2016, another statue was erected in tribute to Georgi Donat, one of the architects of the anti-Jewish legislation during World War II. It was thus unsurprising to hear Orban use anti-Semitic tropes during his re-election campaign in 2017, and especially again, yes, George Soros, the Jewish Hungarian millionaire who supports liberal causes and acts in favor of open borders and immigration. Reanimating the anti-Semitic cliché about the power of Jews, Orban accused Soros of harboring intentions to undermine Hungary. Who did Netanyahu support? Not the anxious Hungarian Jewish community who protested bitterly against the anti-Semitic actions of Orban's government, nor did he choose to support the liberal Jew Soros, who defends humanitarian causes. Instead, he backed Orban, the same who resurrects the dark memory of anti-Semites. And when the Israeli ambassador in Budapest protested the erection of the infamous statue, he was silenced by none other than Netanyahu. To my knowledge, the Israeli Prime Minister's cabinet never officially protested against Orban's anti-Semitic inclinations and affinities. The relationship with Poland is very much like that. In February 2018, President Andrzej Duda declared that he would sign a law making it illegal to accuse the Polish nation of having collaborated with the Nazis. Accusing Poland of collusion in the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities would be from now prosecutable. Israel protested against this proposed legislation, but in June 2018, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Prime Minister of Poland, Morawiecki, signed an agreement exonerating Poland from any and all crimes against the Jews, the expression Polish concentration camp becoming illegal. Netanyahu even signed a statement stipulating that anti-Semitism is identical to anti-Polonism, and that only a handful of sad individuals were responsible for the darkest hours of Poland. And so Poland, not Poland, the nation as a whole. And, you know, Netanyahu is a history buff, and he could not have ignored that, to use the words of the Polish commentator Sławomir Sirakowski. 2/3 of the 250,000 Jews who escaped during the Nazis' liquidation of Jewish ghettos in 1942 had been killed by 1945, most of them by Poles or with Polish participation. And if this was not enough, remember that in 2015, Bibi accused the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem of having suggested the genocide of Jews to Adolf Hitler. Isaac Herzog accused Netanyahu of trivializing the Holocaust. And finally, Netanyahu, about a recent TV series, Our Boys, Netanyahu himself, this is a series that was made about the murder of Mohammed Abu Khdir, and it with HBO, and was on Channel 12. And Netanyahu himself called the series anti-Semitic. So let me go back to the question with which I started. What makes anti-Semitism so often the default option of thoughtlessness? So what I've tried to do with these different vignettes is really to show not exactly a good and bad way of using anti-Semitism, but the ways in which anti-Semitism is intricately related to contradictions of the Jewish political existence. So let me just say a few words very quickly of what I think are these contradictions. One is, I think, the profound entanglement of anti-Semitism with politics, not only in the sense that anti-Semitism takes the form of anti-Zionism, which is the form that is usually discussed. And again, you can find very, very good discussions of this issue in the book that we've been referring to. But also in the sense that Jewish communities themselves are willing to turn their eyes away and shut their ears, as, for example, to the anti-Semitism, blatant anti-Semitism of Trump. Why? Because I think, as I said, because Jewish existence has become tightly connected to Israel. And I think many Jews are now preferring today, certainly this is true in the French community as well, many Jews are preferring their identification to Israel to other matters. So what I'm saying is that it's not only the anti-Zionists which blur the relationship between politics and Israel, but it is also the Jewish communities themselves. It is Israel and the Jewish communities themselves which have created a symbiosis between politics and the fight against anti-Semitism. A second remark is with regard to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, I think, operates according maybe to a different logic, which is invoke anti-Semitism and Nazism when we are talking about the Arabs and the Palestinian enemies, or invent such enemies, but forget the scourge of anti-Semitism when we are talking about other nations who will not vote against Israel in international committees. We see that Netanyahu, in possibly right-wing, in fact, factions, politicize anti-Semitism in a way that not only trivializes it, but actually makes it increasingly difficult to take it seriously when they speak about anti-Semitism. And as an Israeli and as a Jew, I am much more troubled by the fact that the head of the Jewish state can no longer be a moral figure to fight anti-Semitism or to denounce it than by the fact that Jeremy Corbyn laid flowers on the graves of Palestinian terrorists. I'm much more troubled by the fact that the head of the Jewish state cannot have that moral status. And two last remarks. I would say that another reason why it is very difficult, I think, for a part of the left, it's not that I'm making excuses, I'm trying to understand sociologically what has happened to the left. I think that we have two phenomena. One is that the Jews were racialized as whites, and again, Julia Neuberger speaks about this. And they have been racialized as whites because they have become, after World War II, they became disproportionately educated. And after World War II, education became key to social mobility and to social status. And on the other hand, I think that increasingly racism has been, or the victims of racism have been also racialized in the sense of becoming black. It's mostly Arabs, African Americans, or Africans in Europe. So I think there is this immense ambiguity and ambivalence in the sociological status of the Jews vis-a-vis anti-racist ideologies today. And my last remark is this one. Zygmunt Bauman used the term of Allosemitism as a practice of radically separating the Jews from others. Bauman claimed that Allosemitism is the root both of anti-Semitism and philosemitism. That is, he says it's not really hatred that is at the core of anti-Semitism or philosemitism. Rather, it is the fact that the Jews are perceived as a kind of radical other. And this creates enormous ambivalence. Thus, Jewish hatred as such is not what fuels anti-Semitism, but rather the practice of making them different, special, unique, a practice to which I think the memory of the Shoah, as remembered by the Jewish community, contributes a lot. So the fight between Khalifa and Esther Ben Bassat is precisely about that. It is about marking the place of the Shoah as belonging only to the Jews, and it is thus contributing to what Bauman calls allo-Semitism. And so, if you want, the last paradox I want to conclude with is that the Jews have contributed a great deal to this allo-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has become an enormously slippery and ambiguous phenomenon, and this is why it is more than ever, I think, dangerous and difficult to confront. Thank you.